Well, welcome everyone. I hope you started working on and practicing your teaching lesson. These will begin soon, so don't put them off. It is the signature assignment for the course, and it's where you take all the information that we discussed in class and the lectures and even in your readings for those of you who actually read the book, and you apply all that information to a realistic PE lesson. Also, I hope you've thought about and began to work on your issues paper. For those who were in class when I reviewed this, you know it's a pretty big paper. The guidelines have been posted to Moodle. If you select the assignment link, you'll see them posted there. So go ahead, download those, review those, and get started on collecting your resources. Now, regardless of what kind of writer you are, it will be clear as to how much time you spent on this. So don't put it off. Spend some time each day working on your assignments. Now, what I want to cover in this presentation is information related to teaching students with disabilities in the physical education setting. Now, some people think that this is reserved for adapted physical education programs, but there are more and more students with disabilities mainstreamed into general physical education courses. And this is especially important for elementary school teachers, as you'll probably be the first ones to notice if a student has a developmental disability. So let's evaluate the performance of one of my little buddies here, and you tell me what you think. Is there a disability or not? Now, the expectation here is to properly dribble the ball, demonstrating some control and remaining inside the square. So this requires you to know a little bit about the correct skill of dribbling. So you be the judge, possible disability or not. Now you can see there is some trouble in meeting the expectation, and if you carefully observe, you'll see that the student is focused. They're concentrating hard on actually dribbling the ball. He's not using his fingertips, he's slapping the ball, which could contribute to the lack of control. The ball is just bouncing all over the place. He's having trouble keeping it in the square, and it looks like he's trying to keep it in front of him. But basically, he's having a lot of trouble. Now, after observing this student, it's not exactly clear if there is a disability or not, but the challenge that he's having does require some additional observation and other skills to determine if there is an actual disability. Of course, disabilities were not always addressed in schools, and students who struggle with learning physical skills because of a disability were either failed, they were excluded from PE or school altogether, or they were sent to specialized programs in which the parents had to actually pay for any type of instruction they had. Now, PL, or Public Law 94-142, which is known as the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, was passed in 1975. And this law was passed to guarantee that all students with a disability be provided with a free and appropriate public education. And one of the goals of this was to improve access to education for children with disabilities, which included physical education, of course. So not only were students with disabilities given the opportunity to learn, it was required that the learning take place in what was called the least restrictive environment. And this means that the students with a disability can be taught with students who don't have disabilities. And some students may require special accommodations and even an aide or someone to assist them, but they are still in their least restrictive environment. And this included mainstreaming and inclusion, and I'll define those a little bit later. Then in 1990, PL 94-142 was amended to PL 101-476, and it was retitled Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA. And this is when the term handicap was removed, as it carried a lot of negative connotations. So included in PL 101-476, or the IDEA Act, were services provided to students who had other needs and experienced other disabilities, which included autism, traumatic brain injuries, rehabilitation services, and even social work services, which were not included or covered in the previous act. Now, with these acts, public schools were required to observe and screen students for possible disabilities. And for elementary school teachers, this meant ensuring that physical education was part of the daily curriculum, as a lot of the student issues can be determined by challenges in motor skill performance, so it's important to go out for PE. Now, the screening meant teachers were responsible for identifying and evaluating all students to determine if there was an actual disability. So what does this mean in physical education? For screening, physical educators were expected to do basically what is considered a normal part of their teaching responsibilities: teaching skills, observing the students, observing them in their learning and in their application of the skills that they learn, physical fitness testing, are some of those methods that PE teachers should use in trying to identify possible concerns. Going out for regular PE, just observing and being familiar with your students is going to provide some indication as to those students that are struggling, whether it be a social issue or a physical issue. Now, after an initial screening, if you suspect a student may have some type of possible disability, the next step is to assess or evaluate the student a little bit further. Now, with a thorough assessment, there are usually other professionals involved. The teacher is not the only one that handles the assessment. Sometimes it's also a counselor or a health professional like a nurse, and of course, an administrator. Now, by law, the parent must be notified if an assessment is being conducted. It cannot be done without notifying a parent and receiving a consent. So if you're taking your kids out for physical education and you think after your initial screening that somebody may have a possible disability, then it's your responsibility to notify an administrator to try to follow up with the assessment protocols. Now, the due process for parents is there to ensure fair treatment to the parents and the student, and it also explains the guidelines that are going to follow within that assessment. So in due process, written permission is received from the parent to conduct the assessment, and the assessment procedures are then clearly explained and identified to the parent. And if a parent doesn't necessarily agree with the teacher or the school's decision, they can still have an outside organization or company that's not affiliated with the school conduct the assessment or evaluation for their child. And regardless of the outcome of the assessment, whether the parent agrees or disagrees with the outcome, the decision can move forward into a hearing. Sometimes parents just don't want to hear that their child may have a disability. Other times, parents like to push that issue because with a disability comes a lot of other resources and a lot of other attention that students typically don't get if they're not identified with a disability. All of this information must remain confidential. No one involved in the due process is allowed to share any information with anyone else. Now, here's your assignment. You will see 3 different students performing the same skill. So you are expected to write a reflective paper, just brief, based on the video addressing the following. First, just remember, adhere to the basics of APA formatting for your paper when you write it. So number 1, in your paper, I want you to describe the skill, the setting, and what you believe the expectation and requirements are for the student, just based on what you see. Number 2, identify which student you believe is performing the skill correctly and why. And number 3, identify which student is most incorrect or having the most difficulty performing the skill. And with that, you're going to explain what the student is doing incorrectly and what needs to be done to improve the skill. And then number 4, would you recommend the identified student for a disability assessment? And then explain why or why not. So you're going to complete this assignment as a Microsoft Word document, and then you're going to submit it to the online video analysis assignment form in Moodle. So take a look at the videos now. Feel free to stop, rewind, and review the videos as many times as possible. Now, simply because the outcome of an assessment suggests that a child may have a disability doesn't automatically qualify them for an adaptive physical education program. Now, to become eligible for placement in an adaptive physical education program, the student must be assessed and also needs to perform below the 30th percentile on standardized physical education assessments. And those include a motor development assessment, a motor proficiency assessment, fundamental movement skills and patterns assessment, physical fitness assessment, sports skill assessment, and a perceptual motor functioning assessment. So you can see that the assessment and placement criteria is pretty tough for students who are going to be placed in an adaptive physical education program. Then, even if the student qualifies for an adaptive PE program, they can still either be mainstreamed into a general PE class, or they can have inclusion requirements. And when a student is mainstreamed, they're placed in a general PE class, and it's considered the least restrictive environment. The same level of expectations apply to all the students within a mainstream class. With inclusion, students do have special modifications and instructions. Sometimes they need to utilize special equipment, they have a help of an aide, and sometimes additional time is needed in practicing a skill or learning a skill, or modified assessment rubrics are needed. But it's important to note that regardless of a disability, a parent can argue for any physical education instructional setting for their child if they think it's going to be the least restrictive environment. So you can easily have a student who should be in an adaptive physical education program mainstreamed into a general physical education class at the request of a parent. Now, if a student has been diagnosed with a disability, they are required to be placed on an IEP, an individualized education plan. And the IEP is in place to ensure that the student is receiving appropriate instruction in the least restrictive environment again, and as well as to check the progress and learning of the student, just to monitor them to make sure that they're on track for improved learning. Now, in an elementary setting, the teacher is automatically part of the IEP, which also includes a counselor and administrator as well as the parent. In a secondary setting, the PE teacher is always a part of the IEP also, because typically they're the only general education teacher that the student may have. Now, included in the IEP is a host of information about the student, including their current performance levels, test scores, grades, any short-term and long-term goals, different assessment procedures that are required, special services or accommodations that are needed, and anything else that's discussed regarding the learning of the student. So, let's review the issue of least restrictive environment, because you've heard me mention that a few times already. Here's a graphic that represents the LRE. Now, the LRE, least restrictive environment, ranges from a regular PE class all the way to a special program or a special school that only includes students with disabilities. Now, all of these are efforts to help the student not only be successful, but allows the student to learn equally with their peers and takes into consideration the student's strengths and weaknesses. And regardless of the environment in which the students are placed, there are some things that physical education teachers can do to help the students be a little bit more successful in class. So first of all, you need to be creative and set up your objectives and expectations in which students can experience success. And this should be done for all of the students and not only for students with disabilities. This also refers directly to setting up a developmentally appropriate program and using developmentally appropriate instructional techniques. So regardless of the student's developmental level, use equipment, the correct type of equipment, modify expectations, help students enjoy physical activity, and also help them learn. Now, changing the size of boundaries, goals, or targets, changing time limits, modifying manipulatives that are used, and a lot of different other changes can be done for all students and for everyone to experience success, but making sure that these things are done for those students with disabilities. So in PE, you're likely to have a student with a variety of disabilities. So what are some of those, and how do you address those needs? Well, for the most part, students with mental disabilities are not usually mainstreamed for the safety of the student and for the safety of others. And so when you have students that do have that type of disability or who've been diagnosed as having some type of mental disorder, they're not usually going to be placed into a general education setting. But those students do have a little bit difficulty in processing information. They're slower to understand. They're not likely to follow directions immediately. Completing a lot of different tasks and challenges will be difficult for those students. If there are students with visual impairments, those students, although are not typically mainstreamed into class, if they are, there will be a one-on-one aide or a personal assistant for those students. And there usually are specialized equipment that's reserved for those students. A lot of things with balls with sounds, a lot of flashing lights. Sometimes even though they're visually impaired, they can kind of still sense a variety of lights depending upon the severity of their visual impairment. But those students need to have clear instructions, a lot of communication. They need to have a lot of hands-on experiences in order to help them overcome their disability and boost their confidence. There's also students that have auditory impairments. And when you have a student that does have difficulty in hearing, you want to provide a lot of different means of communication. You want to be aware of the feelings of isolation. Sometimes they have a one-on-one aide that will use sign language. Sometimes those students do understand lip reading. They do have speech training, but regardless, there's a lot of visual stimulation that's required for students that do have an auditory impairment. Also, there are students with orthopedic disabilities, and this includes things like splints or braces, crutches, wheelchairs, cast, and those students simply need to be engaged in the best way possible without continuing an injury, of course, and use modified equipment so that they can still experience a sense of working with their peers and being included in the program. There's also students who are experiencing some type of emotionally disturbed disability, and often they're mainstream because they do have success in PE. Students who have emotionally disturbed backgrounds tend to find it comforting when being placed in a regular PE program. Just being active, moving around, following directions and things like that will help those types of students. You also want to make sure that you are aware of the treatment that you're providing for those students, making sure everything is consistent and it's fair, because once a student who does have some type of an emotional disturbed disability recognizes that you are inconsistent in enforcing rules or any expectations or consequences, they will then start to act out. Also, I don't know where you can go to find a small group of students that don't have asthma. Everyone has asthma nowadays. It's a variety of types of asthma. If you talk to a physician, they will always tell you a little bit of exercise monitored is good for students with asthma. And I say monitored because you want to be careful that you're not overexerting those students. But you need to get to know the students. You need to be able to recognize the symptoms of asthma and make sure that students are allowed to gradually and progressively participate in what we call moderate to vigorous physical activity. So allow the student to be able to kind of self-monitor. They will know if the onset of an asthma attack is coming. They can notify you, and then you can back off of some of the exercise activities that you have for them. There are also students who have disabilities such as cerebral palsy, heart conditions, even diabetes. It's important to know and recognize the symptoms of all of these and allow students to kind of self-monitor again, because they will know what they're capable of doing. But recognize the signs such as students who are feeling weak, students that are looking sluggish, students that may show signs of not wanting to engage or participate. Also, students that complain that they're extremely hungry, sometimes shaking, or being able to, or not being able to hold a conversation, saying things that don't make sense. All of those are sometimes signs of a diabetic onset issue. So you want to be sure that you're aware of those when you have those type of students in your physical education class. And we talked a little bit about students who are overweight or obese, those students that have weight problems. And as a teacher, just know that there are several things that those students are unable to do. So just be sure you monitor those students carefully. You help them to set realistic goals and try to work slowly and progressively towards reaching those goals. Make sure those are realistic and not kind of on the same expectation level as general students who don't have any problems in the class, and just monitor them consistently. And so these are some of the things that you can do with students who have specific disabilities. It may range, it may vary. You may not have any disabilities in your class, and you may have a class with multiple students with disabilities. So it all depends, but especially in the elementary school setting, it's important to really take your kids out on a regular basis so that you can identify the possibilities of some of these specific disabilities. And that's it for this presentation. So be sure to follow any other guidelines and expectations you have. Be sure you are working on other course assignments, especially the assignment for this presentation that I mentioned in here before. And always feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Take care.